Okay, so this morning was my witness testimony, and I did allude from time to time in the witness testimony about the fact that you can't hear me. You hear the feedback? Okay, I'll go with the other one.
If he holds it real close, how's that? Is that better? You just hold it right. Okay, the reason you can't hear in the back is because the fans are going. So if you'd like to move forward, you can come sit in these front seats here. We have seats in the bleachers, but you'll be able to hear better the closer you come to the front. Okay, my apologies for that.
Okay, is this good? Is this okay? Yes, no, not really, huh? Okay, I'll try. Okay, I'll try this. Okay, so this morning was my witness testimony, and I made allusions to the fact that, to a lot of things, to the fact that the Catholic Church is Messianic Judaism, that Judaism was to prepare the way for the incarnation, to bring about the salvation of all mankind through Christ, and that the Jews, actually, my book, which I'm sold out of, so I can't be accused of trying to sell more. My first book was called Salvation is from the Jews, which is a quote from John 4:22. Jesus said salvation is from the Jews. And if Jesus said it, it's probably true, right? So that was the role of the Jews in between the Garden of Eden and the coming of Christ. I'll go back to that in a moment. But then we have the second half of salvation history after the incarnation, life, and death of Christ until the second coming. And it's a very real question, why are the Jews still around? What do they have to do with anything? Didn't they do their job? Why haven't they disappeared, and so forth? And that mystery, so to speak, is underlined by the dogma that I mentioned this morning, paragraph 674 of the Catechism. The glorious Messiah's coming is suspended at every moment of history until his recognition by all Israel. In other words, the second coming can't happen until there's a widespread conversion of the Jews. So that's kind of going to be what I hope to talk about now. And before I get, when I get on a roll, I forget everything else. So before I do that, let me say two things. One is, I have some prayer cards on my book table, which you can get afterwards. And they have Edith Stein on the front, and they have a prayer for the conversion of the Jews on the back. And if my head isn't spinning too much, when I close my talk, I'll read the prayer for the conversion of the Jews. And then if you take home a prayer card, you can pray it, if you are so moved. And the other thing is, I know this sounds almost comical right now, but about twice a year I lead pilgrimages to the Holy Land with a particular, as you might guess, Jewish Catholic slant. And my next one is this November of 2024, and then I have one in May of 2025. And if you're feeling a little bit on the brave side, you might want to check it out. I'm going anyway. I went in February, by the way, of this year, and it was my best trip ever because all of the shrines were empty. And I could live, this is not an exaggeration, every morning for an hour and a half, from like 4 to 5:30, I could pray at the foot of the cross all alone. Literally at the foot of the cross on Golgotha. And one night I was able to spend at least an hour and a half inside Jesus' tomb. And normally, you're lucky if you get 10 seconds after you've waited in line for 2 hours. So anyway, there are good things and bad things about going in the middle of a war, but there are good things as well as bad things. Okay, let me focus. Okay, the role of the Jews in between the Garden of Eden and the coming of Christ is pretty straightforward, okay? When God first created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he created them in a state of pre-fallen state, needless to say. There would be no death, there'd be no illness, there'd be no suffering, there'd even be no work really. And Adam and Eve, man would live in a state of peace and intimacy with God from his creation until the end of time. He'd basically be created into heaven in some sense. When man chose to sin, that original, very blessed relationship between God and man was shattered. That at that very moment, God knew that at some point in the future, he would not only restore man to that original blessed state, but actually to an infinitely higher state through the incarnation of the second person of the Most Holy Trinity as a man. If the second person of the Most Holy Trinity was going to incarnate as a man, it would be at a particular point in time, in a particular place in the world, even in the womb of a particular virgin, and that people would have to be prepared. They'd have to be separated out from all the other people on the face of the earth, kept separate for about 2,000 years, while they were receiving a tremendous amount of divine revelation. First of all, they had to learn about the one true uncreated creator God. They had to learn about the creation of man, the fall of man, the seriousness of sin, the need for redemption, the future coming of a Redeemer. They would have to be given enough revelation to understand all of that, to identify the Redeemer when he came, and to be in a position to spread the new religion, so to speak, throughout the world after he came. And that's what the Jewish people were. They were chosen, you could say at random, from all the people on the earth for what it was actually the most important single role given to any ethnic group, which was literally to bring salvation to all of mankind, not through anything special about them, but through their agency as hosting the Messiah when he came. Now, given that they were given this incredibly important, exalted role, you could say, what a shame that they blew it when he came and they didn't recognize him, and instead they crucified him. You're not supposed to say that nowadays, but it's true. I mean, they obviously condemned him to death. And so what a shame that they somehow kind of blew it, having been given this incredibly important role. Well, a second look shows that they didn't really blow it. First of all, they were chosen to enable the incarnation of God as man to come about and to spread the news of his coming, so to speak, to spread a new religion throughout the world. There could hardly be, he did come, and there are 2 billion Christians in the world. They obviously succeeded in that fundamental task. But what about their failure to recognize him when he came? And we know a lot more about that from Romans 11. But before I go into that, I want to read some posts from Pope Benedict. Because Pope Benedict several times pointed out that the fact that the Jews are still around as an identifiable group is proof that they still have a role to play in salvation history. And so I'll read a passage from a book of his, God and the World, which is actually a book-length interview. The questioner says, although the Jews have lived 2,000 years in exile, their religion has not just evaporated. This is a phenomenon without parallel in the history of mankind. The question is whether the development of the world as a whole has not some mysterious connection with the Jewish people. Is Pope Benedict's answer? That actually seems to me to be quite obvious. The way that this tiny people who no longer have any country, no longer any independent existence, but led their life scattered throughout the world and kept their own identity, the way the Jews are still Jews and still a people, even after 2,000 years when they had no country, is an absolute riddle. This phenomenon in itself shows us that something else is at work here. There is something more than mere historical chance at work. The great powers of that period have all disappeared. Israel remains and shows us something of the mystery of God. It is quite obvious that the Jews have something to do with God and that God has not abandoned them. Israel still has a mission to accomplish today. We are in fact waiting for the moment when Israel too will say yes to Christ. But we also know that while history still runs its course, even this standing at the door fulfills a mission, one that is important for the world. In that way, this people still has a special place in God's plan. So that's by way of introduction. What is the mission of this standing at the door? In other words, this period before the widespread conversion of the Jews to precede the second coming. And for that, I'm going to go to Romans 11. I don't want to scare you off making this sound like this is theology or intellectual or something. I don't really know how to avoid that, but I promise that it won't be too long, and I will go to a question and answer, and you can ask me anything, even about my witness testimony, so don't despair yet. Let me turn to Romans 11. I had that backwards there for a moment. Okay. So Romans 11 is really the mother lode of theology about the mystery of the Jews in between the first and second coming. So I will read, I'll read it. The reason I read it from the Bible in front of me is in part to prove that I'm not making it up, because this is very counterintuitive, very almost scandalous what St. Paul says. But my age is showing. I think I may switch to the full-size Bible. Okay, so this is St. Paul talking and answering the question that I tried to introduce. I asked then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Now, nowadays, that's not scandalous, but there were a lot of centuries in the church history when the basic consensus within the church was that the Jews were completely rejected for their failure to follow Christ. But that's not supportable, given St. Paul. Then he goes on to say, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it sought. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see, and ears that should not hear, down to this very day. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see. Okay, this is God speaking. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see and ears that should not hear. Let their eyes be darkened so they cannot see. So obviously the failure of the Jews to recognize Christ wasn't entirely their own fault, but was part of divine providence. So what St. Paul says, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see and ears that should not hear. Now why did God do that? Well, fortunately St. Paul goes on to answer that question. Why did God do that? So I asked, have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means, but through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion be? For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but light from the dead? Okay, so 4 times in these few verses, St. Paul repeats the same idea. Through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Their rejection means the reconciliation of the world. Their failure means riches for the Gentiles. He's saying over and over again, the church would not have spread properly throughout the Gentile world if the Jews had all flooded into the church in the period immediately after the crucifixion. And you see the danger that St. Paul is talking about. If you look at the book of Acts, you see the very first church council, the Council of Jerusalem, called about the year 50, was called to answer this burning question, which was in danger of sinking the early church or jeopardizing the early church. And what was that question? That question was, are we allowed to let non-Jews into the church? Or is the church only for Jews? I know that sounds very funny, but it's really there. And you can see why they were making that mistake. This includes some of the apostles, including St. Peter was making that mistake. Because, of course, Jesus was a Jew, all the apostles were Jews, all of the first wave in the church were Jews, the 3,000 that entered the church on the first Pentecost Sunday. Jesus only spent his life evangelizing Jews and preaching to Jews. It looked like this was a continuation of Judaism, which it was, but it also looked like, well, then it may be only for Jews, or maybe it's like first for Jews and non-Jews are second-class citizens. You can see where that mistake came from. And the first church council had to be called to answer the question, are we allowed to let non-Jews into the church, or does any non-Jew have to first ritually convert to Judaism to qualify for entry into the church? This is a women's group, so I probably shouldn't say this. I mean, it's not a women's group, but it's predominantly women. But I am always tempted to say, since that required, for men, that required circumcision, it would have had a crippling effect on the early church. But anyway, it would have had a crippling effect on the early church. Now, the danger, the error of this theology was resolved at the first church council, the Council of Jerusalem, but practically that danger was avoided by the very fact that within 10 years the church was majority Gentile. So it was, no one can make that mistake anymore because the majority of people in the church were Gentile, and therefore it didn't look like, anything especially Jewish in order to be a member of the church. But that's what's going on behind the scenes when he says, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Their trespass means the riches for the world, their failure means riches for the Gentiles, and their rejection means the reconciliation of the world. But then he goes on to say, look, if their rejection meant the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? In other words, if the Jews' failure to follow Christ was such a blessing for the Gentile world, Gentile only means non-Jew, by the way. It doesn't mean anything special. The Hebrew word underlying Gentile is just peoples. It's just basically the world except for the Jews. So he says, if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? Now, I mentioned earlier that the conversion of the Jews to precede the second coming is stated in the New Catechism of the Catholic Church as church doctrine. There are three other things that are stated that are actually dogma from the Catechism of the Council of Trent that must precede the second coming. They are that the gospel has to be spread throughout the world, that there has to be the great apostasy, a widespread falling away from the faith, and that the Antichrist must make an appearance. Now, when St. Paul here says, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead, that doctrine of the great apostasy, the widespread falling away from the faith, is based in part on what Jesus said just before the crucifixion. If men are like this when the wood is green, what will they be like when the wood is dry? With that image of like spiritual life flowing through humanity, the wood being green, and the spiritual life flowing in humanity having dried up and the wood being dry. So when St. Paul says here, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead, I think it's actually referring to the dogma of the great apostasy. And the life from the dead is, now this is my speculation, this is not dogma, I'm going beyond the dogma. But my speculation is that the entry of the Jews into the church just before the second coming will be a final revitalizing force, counteracting to some extent the falling away from the faith of the countries and the peoples who had been Catholic and had been Christian, that fell away from the faith. Now, St. Paul immediately goes the next line here. If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. Now, the root is Judaism, and the dough offered as first fruits is Judaism. And St. Paul is saying if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. In other words, the Jews, before the time of Jesus, so to speak, the Jews, when Judaism was the real Judaism, they were the locus of holiness in some sense. They were a nation of priests. And St. Paul is saying, look, if those first fruits were holy, the whole lump is holy. And the whole lump being Judaism, even when they're not holy, so to speak, or when they're not holy on the basis of their continued participation with God. And he says, if the root is holy, so are the branches. The root is Judaism, the branches are the Jews, and the branches that are the Jews, some of them are still connected to the tree, but some of them are the Jews that rejected Christ. And St. Paul is actually saying, be careful about what you say about them. I'll just read the next verse. But if the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the richness of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember, it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. You will say branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but do not become proud, for if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. And even the others, if they do not persist in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you have been cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? Now, this is Romans 11. What I just read was verses 16 to 24, and I don't want to push this too hard because it sounds like Jewish chauvinism among other things. But St. Paul is very clearly saying there's something obviously special about that olive tree, which was Judaism. And even the broken off branches, which are the Jews who didn't follow Christ, there's something special about them. So don't get too, on a high horse with respect to them, saying, well, God broke them off to make room for me. They're just ancient history. Because, as St. Paul says, God has the power to graft them in again, and when he does, they'll be even better suited to the cultivated olive tree, because they were original branches of the cultivated olive tree. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
I'll continue. I don't want to say I'm not doing this justice, but obviously I'm kind of racing through, and it's pretty novel stuff in a way to most people. But what I want to do is whet your appetite, and you can go back to Romans 11 and you can, ponder it and stuff. Because if I flesh out every verse, which I love to do, then Romans 11 itself would be an hour and a half long, at least. But by the way, I forgot to mention, I do have a website. If you want an hour and a half version of it, or a 10-hour version, or a 20-hour version of what is Judaism, I have tons of everything on my website is free. I have a YouTube channel. Everything on the YouTube channel is free. The YouTube channel, if you just look for my name and spell it right, you'll find it. The YouTube channel is Jewish Catholic, all one word, and my website is Salvations from the Jews, and I have hundreds of hours of teaching on them, including a series on evolution, that is debunking evolution. Series on the scientific proofs of the Catholic faith, series on Judaism from the beginning until today, all kinds of stuff, including talks on Romans 11, but back to Romans 11. So I'll just wrap 11 here. Lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you to understand this mystery, brethren. A hardening has come upon part of Israel, until the full number of the Gentiles come in. and so all Israel will be saved, okay? A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles come in. And so all Israel will be saved. This is one of the verses that is cited in the Catechism as evidence that there has to be a widespread conversion of the Jews before the second coming. Now that phrase, until the full number of Gentiles come in, is a reference, and I never know what I'm going to say, so I don't have things, Matthew, Mark, Luke, I think it's Luke 21. It's a reference, actually, to Jesus' description of the second coming. He says, the Jews will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So that verse in St. Paul, that is until the full number of Gentiles come in, is echoing until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And then Jesus immediately goes into a description of the second coming. I'm reading now from Luke 21, around verse 24. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and upon the earth distress of nations and perplexity, and the roaring of the sea and the waves, and then fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So you see, this weaving together of the conversion of the Jews in the second coming is actually very scriptural. It's very explicit in Scripture. So I'll go back to Romans 11 now. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. We talked about that. They're enemies of God. They rejected the gospel for your sake, for the sake of the Gentiles. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. Just as, now, okay, I shouldn't get too excited. This stuff is really neat to me. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. For God has consigned all men to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. I'm going to unpack this. This is incredibly beautiful. Just as you were once disobedient to God. In other words, the Gentiles, the non-Jews, were out of relationship to God at the time that Jesus came. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience. In other words, have been brought into relationship with God because of the failure of the Jews to recognize Christ, because of their disobedience. So they have now been disobedient. That's the Jews who are out of relationship with God or out of relationship with Christ. So they have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. In other words, God wanted salvation to come to the Gentiles through the Jews, and he wants salvation to come to the Jews through the Gentiles, right? That's the only possible meaning of that verse. So they have now been disobedient. The Jews are out of relationship, so that in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. By the Gentiles in the church, praying for the conversion of the Jews, and maybe even evangelizing Jews, they also may receive mercy. Why? For God has consigned all men to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. God wanted it to be totally apparent that the infinite gift of salvation is nothing anyone could have earned. It is a free act, sovereign act of the mercy of God. The Jews were in relationship with God at the time of Jesus. If they had immediately come into the church, they would have thought, we earned this, we deserve this, we were so good, this is our reward. They had to pass through a period of disobedience so that when they came into the church, it would be obvious to them that it was a sovereign act of the mercy of God. For God has consigned all men to disobedience that he may have mercy upon all. Make sense? Yeah. Incredibly beautiful. So that is probably where I'm going to stop with Romans 11, because I want to allow time for questions and answers. Just one thing. Of course, this is a moral obligation, it sounds like, for the Gentile church to pray for the conversion of the Jews. How do you evangelize Jews? St. Paul gave the answer to that earlier in the verse. He says, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. And that is how you convert Jews. You make them jealous of what you have in your relationship with the Blessed Virgin Mary, in the consolation you get from receiving the Eucharist, from the understanding of life and death, the meaning of suffering. Jews don't have any concept of the redemptive value of suffering. You have everything that's needed to actually be at peace and happy in this world today. No one else does, okay? No one except a Catholic in a state of grace who buys the whole package can, can do that, can be at peace and have joy, given the trials of the world in general, and especially today. Your job is to make Jews jealous of what you have. You don't have to beat them over the head with, why don't you become Catholic? Do you know what's going to happen to you when you die? You just have to let them see what you have in your knowledge of God, in your relationship with God, in your relationship with the Blessed Virgin Mary. Let them show what you have. Like if you go to work after you come from Mass and go to work in the morning, and you have a little joy in you, and someone asks, what are you so happy about? Don't be shy about it. If you're praying a rosary on the plane and the person next to you says, why are you doing that? Let them know what praying the rosary means to you. Anyway, that's what St. Paul says, and I, as my experience as a Jew, I certainly second that. I know, just give one silly little example. I went to MIT. I was a completely neurotic, New York Jew. All my friends at MIT were totally neurotic New York Jews. The only person I wanted as a roommate, and I moved heaven and earth to get him assigned to me as a roommate, was a good Catholic from a farm family in Iowa. And I wanted him for a roommate because he was happy and peaceful. And all the people like me were always angry and wound up, no fun as a roommate at all. So, that was an early example of wanting what he had, so to speak, being drawn to what a, Catholic in a state of grace radiates. Any questions? I don't know how to take questions, Kitty. The mechanics of it.
Okay, so we have a few questions. Time for a few questions. Yes, ma'am.
Converted.
Have your parents converted?
Thank you for that question. That may be the last question I have time for. First of all, the story of my relationship with my parents after my conversion, after my baptism and so forth, they were fine with it for the first 3 years because I didn't have the nerve to tell them. Then when I told them, they hit the roof, especially my father. He said, I have no son, my son is dead, I never want to hear his name again, and so forth and so on. That only lasted maybe about 6 months because then his paternal love kind of broke through and he had a reestablished relationship with me. But it was very strained, and he was very uncomfortable about everything. And he would be fine when he could forget about my conversion, but if anything reminded him of it, he would get very upset again. And it was like that for a long time. Then my parents I live in Naples, Florida, and my parents got too old to live by themselves in their house in New Jersey. So I moved them down to Naples, and I set them up in a assisted living apartment, and I took care of them and everything. And my father's heart kind of melted, and he got warmer than he had ever been, and so forth. He said things like, I never thought I'd ever have a son like me. What did I ever do to deserve a son like you? I told him you didn't deserve it, but anyway. I guess it was a lot of baggage, but anyway, he got very warm-hearted towards me. And then actually, he had all his wits about him, but he was 102 and a half. And he fell, and he broke his thigh bone. And then that's a spiral downward, so to speak. And he was in the hospital, and then he was in rehab. And the rehab experience was extremely painful and unpleasant, especially the check-in And I was with him, I was taking care of him this whole time and eating dinner with my parents, 3 or 4 times a week and so forth. And so anyway, so I help him check into the rehab, which was torture for him. And then I go home and I come back the next morning and he's sitting up in bed, his eyes are sparkling, and he says, last night when all the commotion was over and everyone had left and the room was dark, Jesus appeared to me. Interesting, don't you think? And that's all he said. He said, interesting, don't you think? But after that, like once I forgot to wear my crucifix, and he said, where's that thing you usually wear around your neck? You really ought to wear it, and stuff like that. And I was able to baptize him on Good Friday that year. And he died on Easter Tuesday. As a matter of fact, I don't want to say I killed him, but I was leading a pilgrimage to Israel that week, basically Easter week, and I was leaving on Saturday, and I made a deal. I told God, if he doesn't die by Tuesday, I have to cancel the trip. Because, I had to give people time to cancel and everything. So anyway, but it was a very happy ending. And, but then my mother, the way my mother took this was, oh boy, first my son goes over to the enemy, and now my husband went over to the enemy. So she got much more hostile towards the Catholic Church after my father died. And, but then the same thing kind of happened. She ended up in a nursing home. She had broken her hip, and she was on her back. She was only 98, so it wasn't the same situation. And actually, her mind was a little less clear than my father's. But anyway, she was on her back, and all she could do was really stare at the ceiling. And so I figured, okay, now it's safe for me to tell her my witness testimony. So one day when I was visiting her, I told her my witness testimony. And nothing, she didn't respond really. But the next morning when I visited her, she was much more lively, and she was sitting up in bed. And she said, I want to really thank you for what you did yesterday. Really, really thank you, because my childhood belief in God came back. My mother was pious as a child, but when she was in a horrible situation, having been captured by the Gestapo, I don't want to go into details, she lost her faith in God. And actually, she lost her faith in God from a survivor syndrome. In other words, she escaped, but no one else escaped. And she felt so guilty by why me that her resolution was that God couldn't exist because she could not handle the responsibility of having been spared. So anyway, she said all her childhood faith came back. And after that, every time I visited her with my wife, all she wanted was for us to pray the rosary. All she wanted was, for us to pray. She would mouth, she was too weak to actually vocalize, but she would mouth the Hail Marys and so forth. And then I'm a member of a traditionalist parish, FSSD parish, Latin Mass parish. And the priest came and I had baptized her. He came, he confirmed her, he vested her with brown scapula, he gave her an apostolic blessing, and he gave her last rites. And she was buried out of a sung Tridentine Requiem Mass. With all the candles, with all the incensing, with all the altar boys, with all the sprinkling, and we processed from the church to the cemetery where I have a plot. And again, with the priest and all the incense and the sprinkling and everything, and about 20 or 30 of the parishioners came, and we were all around the grave, and the priest in his black vestments and everything, and she was lowered into the grave. But the funniest part was the Jewish section of the cemetery, because I had bought the plot earlier. So I don't know what they thought. Of course, all of the dead Jews knew that my mother was very lucky. That's something to remember. It's very normal for a Jew to not want to enter the church because, what will my dead grandfather think? So it's very good to remind them that your dead grandfather knows the truth now and wishes for nothing more than not going to the church. Anyway, thanks for the question.
Great question. Yeah. Time for a couple more. Yeah,
That's what we want to know. What was she wearing? And, what color was her hair? And, more details.
We want details, Roy.
Okay, first of all, she wasn't the most beautiful woman I ever saw, because she was so much more beautiful than any other woman could possibly be, that comparisons are odious. I mean, in other words, she was in a league of her own by far. I would have put her age at maybe 17 or something like that. She was very young, 17, 18. My initial answer when people ask me what was she wearing is, I'm a guy, I never noticed what women were wearing, but actually I did notice a little bit. So it's hard. Okay, again, I don't want to fill in any blanks that are not in the memory. But that's okay. She was wearing what do you call that? A tunic, a gown, a dress? Well, it's not a dress like you guys wear, right? But anyway, she was wearing this draped dress that was, my guess would be like that, was down pretty much to the ground. My memory of the color was that it was a kind of ivory, goldish kind of color, ivory, I'd say. I don't remember any blue, to tell the truth. She had a veil, but she had a couple of locks of hair that were visible coming out from her veil. And what color? It was, the hair was, I'd say, I'll tell you why I'm laughing. I have to say it was very light brown, because really what it was dirty blonde, but how can you use the word dirty? So whatever you call that, but it was a kind of a dark blonde. And she had, most of the representations, European representations of the Blessed Virgin Mary, do have what, to my memory, is the right face shape, which is somewhat triangular, narrow chin, small mouth, and actually more so than that one. But anyway, you know what? The Tiolina statue from Medjugorje, you know that one? That is pretty on target with my memory.
One more, Mike? Yes. This is Jean. Do you still have the same type of visions now that you had early on?
I wish. No, definitely not. This was, I don't know how to put it, but this was a lost leader. It was a special thing, and it's not I don't know how to put it, it's not the texture of my spiritual life by a long shot.
I have a question, actually. One of the things, is that the statue you're talking about of Mary?
Yeah, that's the statue.
Y'all can see this statue of Mary. You must have seen that. Yeah. So my question, one of the things I was really struck by, that's quite a storm, that I was struck by was when, Troy, you said that when that experience of meeting Christ on the beach, before you knew it was him, that you were so shocked to realize that your whole life, and tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, you had been swimming in this ocean of love, submerged in love. Everything around you was love, the love of God being expressed for you, and that you were not aware of it. Would that be accurate?
It's not bad. It's pretty good, yeah.
Okay. Do you want to improve on what I just said? Because then I'm going to have a further question.
Well, because the swimming, it's really the swimming part that I'm not entirely comfortable with.
Yeah.
I usually say I was held in an ocean of love without being aware of it. If you're swimming, you're usually aware of your water. So
you were surrounded by, submerged in love, and hadn't until that moment become aware of it. And my question is, how do you and how do we remain present to that reality?
Well, I cheat. I get to give my witness testimony and get reminded of it. I don't remain present to that reality. I get anxious. I get everything, you know, and I have to remind myself of that experience sometimes. So I think it's the same situation. I mean, obviously, you try to stay in a state of grace. You frequent the sacraments. You do adoration. You pray the rosary. Spiritual reading is very important because every saint agrees with every other saint about everything important. Have you noticed that? You know, it's like, it's like you don't really have to bother making distinctions between them because on all the important stuff, they're seeing exactly the same thing. They're interpreting, everything that happens in exactly the same way. There's no such thing as a saint that doesn't believe that everything that happens is divine providence, and so forth. So reading the saints is really important to kind of confirm your sense of the reality of that perspective. But, if I had a magic formula, I would bottle it and sell it, make a lot of money.
Now, on your YouTube channel, do you pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet every day?
I do. If I don't pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet on special days, sometimes I pray the Rosary, but yeah, I pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet every day. But I do that just as a kind of introduction, because as you know, that takes about 10 minutes. It sounds like you're making this an introduction, Divine Mercy Chaplet, but anyway. But then I babble, then I talk, and I just come, and I talk about maybe this is like the saint of the day, or something that's on my mind, or the liturgy reading from the day, or whatever.
And so for people, if they want to pray with you every day, that's only on YouTube? Is that where they go?
That's on YouTube. Again, my channel is Jewish Catholic, all one word, as opposed to The Jewish Catholic, because there's another pushy Jewish Catholic who has already took that name. And the show is at various times because, I have other obligations at times. So it started out always being at 3, but it's usually either 3 or 5.
All right, one more question. Anybody? Do you have a speaking tour, like a regular schedule coming up with people?
I speak all over, but the places are very dispersed. So on my website, I try to keep a list of engagements of where I'm going to be. But I only speak, I don't know, it's maybe like once a month or something, so it's not like, it's not like continual. I think the next one is, I have a couple in the Boston area in October, then I have one in Nashville in November, anyway, that's what comes to mind.
Okay, we got one more question.
How did your colleagues at Harvard handle your conversion?
How did my colleagues at Harvard handle my conversion? Well, most of them I didn't talk about it very much, because it's pretty strange. But my best friend was also Jewish on the Harvard Business School faculty, and I told him, and the best way to describe his reaction was it was as though I had told him a spaceship landed in my backyard last night and I was taking it up to a mothership, and I'm now in continual communication with it. He just thought I had gone nuts, but he didn't know whether I was dangerous or not, so he didn't want to let me know that he thought I had gone nuts. And he just kind of politely, left the room, so to speak, and didn't, gave me the cold shoulder after that. So that's really was the typical reaction. The only Jewish friends that I could talk to about this were actually seriously religious Jews. And they respected the fact that I thought Jesus was the Messiah. And they were happy to talk about why I thought Jesus was the Messiah and why they thought he couldn't be the Messiah, if you see what I mean. There was traction there, but there was no traction with the normal secular people.
Okay, how wonderful is Roy? Can we give him a round of applause? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Roy is going to read this prayer for the conversion of the Jews.
Okay.
I won't talk too much, but this prayer is from the First Vatican Council in the 1860s. It's a postulatum, which means a petition. It was circulated at the council. It was signed by almost all the council fathers. It was hardly endorsed by the Pope of the council, who is Blessed Pope, someone the highest ninth. And here's the prayer. The undersigned fathers of the council humbly yet urgently pray that the Holy Ecumenical Council of the Vatican come to the aid of the unfortunate nation of Israel with an entirely paternal invitation, that finally exhausted by a wait no less futile than long, the Israelites hasten to recognize the Messiah, our Savior Jesus Christ, truly promised to Abraham and announced by Moses, thus completing and crowning, not changing the Mosaic religion. The undersigned fathers have the very firm confidence that the Holy Council will have compassion on the Israelites, because they are always very dear to God on account of their fathers, and because it is from them that the Christ was born, according to the flesh. Would that they then speedily acclaim the Christ, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord. Would that they hurl themselves into the arms of the Immaculate Virgin Mary, even now their sister according to the flesh, who wishes likewise to be their mother according to grace, as she is ours. Amen.
Thank you so much, Roy. So, okay.